Have you ever wondered if silence is truly golden or just a black hole swallowing your soul? Standing in that freezing hospital corridor, watching the man I once called my husband use over $200,000 to buy forgiveness for his sins, I realized a bitter truth. Some debts cannot be paid with apologies. I spent 12 months gathering these files not to win him back, but to execute my own redefinition of justice. Hello to the wonderful audience of Haley Revenge Stories. Sadly, YouTube has completely disabled our monetization features, leaving us without the necessary budget to keep our channel operating. If you find today's story compelling, please consider supporting us with just $1 so our team can pay their living expenses and continue creating these stories for you. You can easily donate by scanning the PayPal QR code currently on your screen or by clicking the link provided in the description or the comments section below. My name is Alice Baker, and this is where my silence truly began. The call that shifted the axis of my universe came on a Tuesday afternoon. The voice on the other end belonged to a billing specialist at St. Jude's Gateway Hospital. Her tone was rehearsed and devoid of empathy as she informed me that my young daughter's overdue medical fees had reached an unmanageable sum of $85,420. My breath hitched in my throat. The air in the sterile hospital corridor felt instantly thinner, pressing down on my chest like a physical weight. I had exhausted every bank loan, maxed out every single credit card, and burned through every favor I could ask of friends and family. I was drowning in a sea of stark white walls, the relentless beeping of medical monitors mocking my absolute helplessness. The debt had spiraled far beyond my control, threatening to rip away the ongoing treatments my little girl desperately needed to survive. Then he appeared. Brian, my ex-husband, and a man who wielded significant ruthless influence in the lucrative world of medical data management. He walked into that desolate corridor wearing a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than my rent for an entire year. He did not look like a devastated father worried about his sick child. He looked exactly like an untouchable corporate executive stepping in to aggressively handle a minor public relations crisis. In a sudden impulsive display of power and perhaps a twisted fleeting sense of guilt, he walked straight past me to the billing counter. He swiped his sleek metal corporate card and cleared the entire $85,420 in a matter of seconds. I stood there frozen, my mind struggling to process the transaction. He turned to face me smoothly, sliding the card back into his expensive leather wallet. He looked at my exhausted face, the dark circles under my eyes, and my trembling hands. In a moment of bizarre remorse, he offered a proposal that sounded more like a business contract. "Alice, come back to me. Let us be a family again." He expected tears of relief. He fully expected me to fall to my knees in pathetic gratitude, or perhaps scream at him for his past betrayals. Instead, I gave him absolutely nothing. I looked at him with entirely empty eyes. All the warmth, all the love, and all the fierce fight had been systematically bled out of me over the past 24 months of struggling alone in the dark. "All right," I said. "Just a single word. No hesitation. No anger." Our new life began under a heavy, suffocating blanket of an unspoken rule. We packed our meager belongings and moved back into his sprawling, perfectly sterile mansion. From day one, my daughter and I became little more than ghosts haunting our own home. We were completely silent. We were perfectly, flawlessly obedient. I made sure we never took up too much space or made too much noise. More importantly, we never raised a single dispute about his other woman. Her name was Clara, the woman he had abandoned us for the woman who still lingered aggressively in the margins of his busy life. In the past, the mere mention of her name would send me into a violently painful spiral of agony. Now I treated her existence like an inconvenient weather forecast on a day I planned to stay indoors anyway. It was completely irrelevant to my daily routine. This sudden drastic change in my demeanor deeply unsettled Brian. He was a narcissistic man who thrived on control drama and emotional chaos. He needed to know he actively affected the people around him. My absolute unwavering compliance became a pristine mirror reflecting his own unacknowledged guilt, and he despised it. It made him wildly insecure and deeply paranoid. He began to intentionally leave deliberate breadcrumbs of his continued infidelity around the house. He would casually mention Clara's preferences during dinner, or leave his unlocked phone sitting conspicuously on the kitchen counter, practically begging me to snoop through his messages. He desperately wanted the old Alice back. He wanted the broken woman who would cry, yell, and fight for his meager scraps of affection. "Did you see the receipt for the diamond bracelet I bought yesterday?" he asked one evening, his eyes sharply searching my face for even a tiny flicker of jealousy. "I saw it," I replied calmly, wiping down the cold marble countertop with a damp cloth. "It is very beautiful." He clenched his jaw tightly, profoundly frustrated by his total failure to elicit a reaction. He could not understand that the fragile woman he broke no longer existed. In her place was someone entirely different, someone who had realized that arguing with a monster was a losing game. I had finally discovered the ultimate truth about power dynamics in abusive relationships. When you stop fighting entirely, they inevitably drop their guard. By transforming my absolute submission into a flawless, impenetrable shield, I made myself functionally invisible to his ego. And an invisible person can see everything. I began my quiet, methodical process of gathering. Every discarded bank receipt, every carelessly spoken word on his business calls, every late-night meeting he scheduled in his home office, I absorbed it all. My silence was not a surrender. It was the careful, calculated, and deadly breath a sniper takes before pulling the trigger. I was no longer playing the role of a devoted wife. I was an archivist of his sins, silently cataloging every single piece of dirt until I had exactly what I needed to bury him completely. The grand ballroom of the Grand Heritage Hotel was an ocean of dark velvet and cascading white orchids. It was the evening of the annual Pediatric Health Fundraiser, a spectacular charity gala orchestrated entirely to polish Brian's public image and seamlessly introduce Clara to high society under the guise of philanthropy. She stood closely by his side, draped in a custom backless emerald silk gown, smiling radiantly for the flashing cameras, as if she were a benevolent saint descending from the heavens. They were publicly celebrating their joint pledge of $2 million to the local children's ward. From my shadowed corner near the heavy velvet curtains, the entire scene looked exactly like a brilliantly directed stage play. Waiters glided past me carrying silver trays of vintage champagne that cost $300 a bottle, while I stood silently holding a simple glass of tap water. The glaring contrast between the excessive, suffocating luxury in this room and the silent, terrifying suffering of the families they claimed to help twisted sharply in my gut. I was playing the role of the supportive, quiet wife, flawlessly blending into the background wallpaper, while Brian and his mistress soaked in the endless adulation. During the daylight hours, my camouflage continued to deepen. I had previously convinced Brian that I needed a simple, mindless routine to keep my anxiety occupied, so he graciously secured me a low-level administrative position in the Medical Records Archive of DataCorp, his sprawling corporate empire. It was a windowless, temperature-controlled basement facility located exactly 42 floors beneath his sunlit executive suite. To Brian, it was the perfect invisible place to hide a dull, broken wife. To me, it was the absolute center of the labyrinth. Surrounded by miles of physical filing cabinets and rows of flickering digital servers, I possessed the one thing Brian had severely underestimated. I had unrestricted low-level system access. No highly paid executive ever pays attention to the quiet archivist scanning and organizing 5-year-old patient intake forms. When I returned home to the sprawling mansion every evening, the true emotional cost of our arrangement became agonizingly clear. My daughter Maya was learning a psychological lesson no 7-year-old child should ever have to master. In the early days, she would wait anxiously by the heavy oak front door at 8 o'clock sharp, hoping her father would come in and scoop her into his arms. Now she understood the cold, unspoken reality of our existence. Instead of crying when he ignored her to take a business call, or left the house again to see Clara. Maya taught herself how to violently detach. I watched from the hallway doorway one evening as she sat completely alone on her bedroom rug. Her small chest rose and fell in a deliberate, rigidly measured rhythm. Inhale for 4 seconds. Hold for 4 seconds. Exhale for 4 seconds. She was systematically controlling her own breathing, aggressively calming her nervous system, so she would not need the comforting embrace of a father who viewed her merely as a paid-off liability. It broke my heart into 1,000 jagged pieces, but it also hardened my resolve into absolute solid steel. Back in the freezing depths of the data core archive, my late-night searches began to yield incredibly poisonous fruit. While auditing a seemingly routine batch of internal communications from the previous fiscal year, I bypassed a loosely encrypted firewall and stumbled directly into a hidden directory. My eyes scanned lines of code and classified internal memos that sent a terrifying chill down my spine. It was a sophisticated, deliberate manipulation of the pharmaceutical priority lists. Brian and his elite executive team were actively altering the distribution algorithm. They were bypassing desperate low-income patients who had waited for over 14 months on standard insurance, and secretly diverting life-saving experimental drugs to wealthy private clients who paid enormous unrecorded premium fees. The system was rigged to show a 99% success rate in drug allocation, but the underlying truth was a massive silent graveyard of altered timelines and falsified denial letters. Whenever Brian felt a sudden fleeting pang of guilt for his actions at work or his ongoing affair with Clara, he tried to smother that guilt with gross displays of wealth. He would come home and place extravagant items on my dressing table. A designer handbag worth $6,200. A diamond pendant that likely cost upwards of $15,000. He honestly thought these shiny trinkets were buying my continued passive submission. He did not know that the moment he left the bedroom, I opened a plain black leather-bound notebook. I did not wear the jewelry. I cataloged it. I meticulously recorded the date, the brand, the exact serial numbers, and the estimated retail value of every single item. To me, these were not romantic gifts. They were a precise, undeniable ledger of his guilt, a physical manifestation of the bribes he used to silence his own conscience. I knew, however, that I could not dismantle a titan like DataCore entirely on my own. I needed someone on the inside who completely understood the technical architecture of his corruption. I thought of Elias, a brilliant senior database architect who had been abruptly and viciously demoted by Brian just 6 months prior. Elias had tried to raise ethical questions about data discrepancies at a board meeting and was instantly crushed by Brian's corporate machinery. I found Elias sitting at a dimly lit coffee shop exactly 3 miles away from the corporate headquarters. "Why are you sitting here with me, Alice?" Elias asked, stirring his black coffee nervously, his eyes darting toward the door. "Your husband made sure I will never work in senior management again." "Because, Elias," I replied, my voice perfectly steady and completely empty of fear, "I am not here as his wife. I am here because I have seen the hidden priority lists on the basement servers, and I know exactly how we are going to burn his entire empire to the ground." It had been exactly 3 weeks since Brian started leaving his personal smartphone completely unlocked and unattended on the gleaming kitchen island. In the past, this would have been an irresistible trap for a jealous wife. Now I walked right past the glowing screen every single morning without casting a single glance downward. One Tuesday morning, he practically shoved the device into my line of sight, while his messaging app blinked rapidly with 7 new notifications from Clara. I simply pushed the expensive piece of metal aside to place his perfectly brewed cup of black coffee on the granite counter. I saw the muscle in his jaw twitch violently. My absolute lack of surveillance was fundamentally destroying his psychological equilibrium. He was a man who thrived entirely on the chaotic energy of 2 women aggressively fighting over him. By withdrawing my participation from his twisted game, I starved his ego. He began to sleep poorly, waking up at exactly 3 in the morning to pace the heavy hardwood floors, his mind spinning wildly as he wondered what exactly I was planning behind my blank stares. Clara felt the shifting tectonic plates of our dynamic, too. The intoxicating thrill of being the triumphant other woman quickly sours when the legal wife flatly refuses to play the role of the defeated, weeping victim. We ran into each other at a highly exclusive private country club luncheon. Just 12 months ago, the sight of her would have caused me to flee to the nearest restroom in tears. This time, I walked straight up to her table, smiled a perfectly empty practice smile, and complimented the tailoring of her designer dress. I spoke to her with the icy clinical calm of a mortician examining a lifeless body. Clara physically recoiled from me. The smug, victorious smirk vanished instantly from her heavily contoured face, replaced by a deep, creeping paranoia. She finally realized she had not successfully stolen a prize husband. She had willingly accepted a ticking time bomb, and the person quietly holding the detonator was standing right in front of her, completely and terrifyingly unafraid. To build an airtight legal case, I needed tangible, irrefutable proof of his willingness to illegally manipulate medical resources for his personal inner circle. With Elias providing critical technical oversight from his hidden terminal, I carefully manufactured a highly specific crisis. I scheduled a comprehensive urgent respiratory evaluation for Maya at the primary data core affiliated clinic on the exact same afternoon that Clara's daughter Lily was booked for a routine non-essential allergy screening. Both medical tests required immediate processing by the exact same centralized diagnostic laboratory. I knew Brian meticulously monitored the very important person-patient intake logs on his private monitor. I sat quietly in his home office, hiding a tiny high-definition voice-activated recording device underneath the heavy mahogany desk. When the chief clinic administrator called him directly to report a massive unexpected backlog at the testing lab, I listened intently as Brian made the damning choice. "Push the allergy screening for Lily to the absolute front of the queue immediately," Brian commanded through the encrypted speakerphone, his voice dripping with arrogant, unchecked authority. "Bypass the respiratory ward entirely. I do not care if there are 50 pediatric patients waiting for critical breathing diagnostics. You get Lily's results processed and finalized in the next 45 minutes, or you are permanently fired by the end of the day." He casually compromised the vital health data processing of dozens of sick children, including his own biological daughter, just to quickly appease his demanding mistress. I pressed the stop button on my hidden device. The audio recording was absolutely crystal clear. It was corporate malpractice captured in high definition. The emotional fallout of his callous choices eventually seeped directly into his own home, striking him in a way he never anticipated and could not control. That same evening, Brian attempted to play the role of a caring, involved father to alleviate his own underlying guilt. He walked confidently into the living room and found Maya quietly reading a thick book on the rug. He sat heavily on the velvet sofa next to her and asked her why she never came into his home office to say goodnight to him anymore. Maya did not even look up from her printed pages. She answered him with the brutal, unfiltered honesty that only a 7-year-old child possesses. "I learned that when I make noise, you get angry and leave the house," she said, her young voice entirely flat and devoid of emotion. "So I practiced being perfectly quiet. Now I do not need to bother you, and you do not need to pretend you want to stay here with us." Brian froze completely. All the color drained instantly from his face. It was a perfectly delivered strike, a chilling display of emotional alienation that entirely shattered his fragile illusion of being a respected, loved patriarch. He had absolutely no response. He simply stood up and walked away, suddenly realizing he was a ghost in his own house. Meanwhile, the sheer volume of digital evidence I had successfully gathered with Elias was growing far too massive and far too dangerous to keep on a single, easily discoverable hidden flash drive. If Brian's elite corporate security team detected even a fraction of a percent of our unauthorized server access, they would wipe the internal network clean in under 60 seconds. Elias and I desperately needed an indestructible digital vault. Working under the heavy cover of darkness on a quiet Saturday night, we successfully bypassed the primary data core security grid. We established a continuous, heavily encrypted data pipeline to an external offshore server located thousands of miles away across the ocean. It took us exactly 6 hours and 20 minutes to securely clone the entire directory of falsified pharmaceutical priority lists, the manipulated patient wait times, and the newly acquired devastating audio recordings. We set up an automated fail-safe protocol. Every single piece of corrupted data, every documented financial bribe, and every manipulated laboratory result was now safely locked away in the cloud. No matter what happened to me, the evidence was permanent and untouchable. The tiny cracks in Brian's pristine mirror were no longer just visible. The glass was groaning under the pressure, ready to shatter completely. The atmosphere in our house had thickened from merely uncomfortable to completely unbreathable. I was no longer simply gathering evidence. I was actively weaving a highly complex, inescapable noose. The final devastating layer of my arsenal arrived on a heavily raining Thursday afternoon. I had arranged a highly discreet off-the-grid meeting at a secluded private botanical garden on the outskirts of the city with a woman named Evelyn. She was the legally separated ex-wife of a former DataCorp senior executive, a man who had been ruthlessly pushed out and financially ruined by Brian exactly 2 years prior. Evelyn had recently heard quiet whispers through the intricate corporate grapevine about a low-level archivist asking incredibly dangerous questions in the basement, and she actively sought me out. We sat closely together on a damp, cold wooden bench, completely surrounded by tall, dripping ferns, as she cautiously slid a thick, heavy, unmarked manila envelope across the narrow space between us. Inside that waterproof envelope were the absolute final nails required for Brian's professional coffin. Evelyn provided me with highly classified, unredacted financial transcripts confirming a terrifying reality. Brian had systematically and intentionally blocked over $7,500,000 in emergency medical grants. These were crucial government-backed funds explicitly earmarked for critical pediatric care facilities. Instead of allowing the money to save lives, Brian had intentionally rerouted the massive capital through a series of shell accounts to artificially inflate the quarterly profit margins of his own private investment factions. He had literally starved dying children of their legitimate funding just to ensure his personal executive cash bonus cleared the $3 million mark that fiscal year. Holding those heavily stamped, irrefutable documents in my trembling hands, my cold resolve hardened into pure, unadulterated ice. The scale of his monstrous greed was beyond anything I had ever imagined. Armed with this apocalyptic knowledge, I decided it was time to actively torment his psychological state. I began to carefully and methodically leave tiny, deliberate anomalies in his meticulously controlled environment, effectively shifting his extreme paranoia from his personal life directly to his corporate survival. I started with incredibly small, subtle adjustments. I would enter his locked private home office while he was showering and slightly shift the angle of his most confidential printed financial ledgers, just enough for his obsessive-compulsive nature to notice someone had touched them. 2 days later, I left a freshly printed, highlighted copy of the Federal Penal Code regarding public health fraud resting casually on the carpet underneath his expensive leather briefcase. One evening, I took a thick red pen and circled the specific name of a denied pediatric patient on a routine document he had carelessly left on the marble dining table. The psychological impact on him was immediate, severe, and spectacular to witness. Brian stopped sleeping entirely. He began abruptly firing his loyal personal assistants, without cause frantically changing his network security passwords every 48 hours, and constantly glancing over his shoulder during dinner. He firmly believed a federal investigative agency or a rival corporate board member was actively hunting him. He never once suspected the quiet, obedient ghost peacefully pouring his morning coffee. The absolute breaking point the moment the final mask slipped occurred during a critical, high-stakes dinner party hosted in our formal dining room. Brian had aggressively courted Richard, the primary majority shareholder of DataCorp, inviting him to our home to solidify a massive, upcoming corporate merger worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Brian desperately needed to project the flawless image of a perfectly stable, deeply loyal, and highly successful family man. The massive mahogany table was set with heavy silver cutlery and imported crystal glasses. We were exactly 1 hour and 15 minutes into the agonizingly polite multi-course dinner when Brian decided to deploy his favorite, most transparent manipulative tactic. He reached into his tailored suit jacket pocket and proudly pulled out a velvet jeweler's box. He snapped it open to reveal a blindingly bright sapphire and diamond necklace, declaring loudly to Richard that it was a spontaneous token of his endless profound appreciation for his wonderful, supportive wife. He fully expected me to smile warmly, blush deeply, and allow him to step behind my chair to fasten the heavy gold chain around my neck, perfectly securing his pristine public facade. Instead, I gently placed my heavy silver fork down on the delicate porcelain plate. I looked directly at the sparkling jewels, then slowly, deliberately raised my eyes to meet his forced smile. "I cannot accept this, Brian," I said. My voice was incredibly calm, yet it sliced through the warm, ambient noise of the large room like a freezing, jagged blade. Brian chuckled nervously, quickly glancing at his immediately confused business partner. "Nonsense, darling. You deserve the absolute best things in life." "I do not want it," I replied, holding his gaze with dead, unblinking eyes. We both know exactly how many denied patient claims it took to purchase those specific stones. Keep it. My silence has officially priced itself entirely out of your budget. The silence that violently crashed down upon the dining room was absolute, heavy, and utterly terrifying. Richard froze completely, his expensive wine glass hovering exactly halfway to his open mouth. Brian's face drained of all human color, instantly turning a sickly pale shade of gray. The air grew so densely thick, it felt as though the oxygen had been mechanically vacuumed directly out of the room. I simply stood up elegantly, excused myself to our completely stunned guest, and walked slowly up the grand staircase, leaving Brian entirely alone to navigate the catastrophic burning wreckage of his carefully curated corporate image. Later that exact same night, the inevitable violent explosion occurred. Brian stormed frantically into the master bedroom, his eyes wide, bloodshot, and completely unhinged. He had completely abandoned the smooth, charismatic executive persona. He was a cornered, rabid animal desperate for survival. "Are you completely out of your damn mind?" he screamed, his voice vibrating with unfiltered rage, his hands balling into tight fists. "Do you have any idea what you just did down there? I will completely destroy you, Alice. I will freeze every single bank account by tomorrow morning. I will permanently cancel Maya's premium health insurance. You will be out on the freezing street with absolutely $0 and no possible way to pay for her specialized treatments. You are nothing without my money and my protection." He stood towering aggressively over me, his chest heaving violently, fully expecting me to cower in fear, apologize profusely, and desperately beg for mercy, just as I had done 1,000 times in our miserable past. I simply sat comfortably on the edge of the large mattress, crossing my legs slowly and adjusting the sleeve of my robe. I looked up at him, not with an ounce of fear, but with the clinical, entirely detached fascination of a senior scientist observing a severely damaged, trapped insect. "You cannot freeze financial accounts that have already been legally separated and heavily shielded by federal whistleblower protection protocols," I stated simply. I watched the violent, chaotic confusion instantly wash over his furious face. "And you absolutely will not cancel Maya's insurance, because the second you even try the 120-page public health violation lawsuit my attorney filed under a strict federal seal exactly 48 hours ago will become public record immediately. I have the crystal clear audio recordings, Brian. I have the fully cloned offshore server logs. I have Evelyn's verified financial transcripts detailing the exact $7,500,000 you intentionally stole from dying pediatric patients." His mouth opened wide, but absolutely no sound came out. The brutal, inescapable reality of his dire situation violently slammed into him like a freight train. In that singular moment, I seamlessly transitioned from the submissive broken wife to a completely cold, calculating, and untouchable observer. I was no longer a weak participant in his abusive psychological game. I was the undisputed referee holding the final red card. "You have spent the last 12 months thinking you were cleverly controlling me." I whispered, the corners of my mouth slowly pulling into a sharp, entirely humorless smile. "But I have been exactly where you put me, sitting perfectly quiet in the dark, patiently watching you dig your own corporate grave. And Brian, you dug it incredibly deep." He stumbled backward, physically knocking hard into the heavy wooden dresser, his hands scrambling for purchase. He began aggressively hyperventilating, completely and utterly stripped of his immense power. He finally saw the real lethal version of me, and the crushing realization that he had entirely lost control of his massive empire. His false narrative and his own freedom brought the great untouchable CEO instantly crashing down to his trembling knees. The highly anticipated annual shareholder summit for Datacorp was scheduled for 9 o'clock on a crisp Wednesday morning. It was the absolute pinnacle of Brian's corporate calendar, held in the breathtaking glass-walled conference amphitheater on the 60th floor of the headquarters. Over 300 of the most powerful institutional investors, venture capitalists, and pharmaceutical executives were gathered, expecting a triumphant presentation on the projected revenue growth for the next fiscal decade. Brian stood at the center of the polished mahogany stage, looking immaculate in a charcoal bespoke suit, holding a sleek remote and beaming with the arrogant confidence of a king addressing his loyal subjects. He was in the middle of confidently explaining how their proprietary data sorting algorithms had successfully increased hospital efficiency by an unprecedented 42%. He had absolutely no idea that I was standing quietly in the sealed audiovisual control booth, suspended directly above the amphitheater, standing shoulder to shoulder with Elias, who had his fingers hovering over a master override keyboard. "Execute the sequence," I told Elias, my voice completely devoid of any hesitation. Elias pressed the enter key instantly, severing the main executive feed and replacing it with the direct pipeline from our secure offshore server. Down on the stage, Brian clicked his remote to transition to his next slide, fully expecting a vibrant pie chart detailing corporate philanthropy. Instead, the massive 80-foot high-definition screen behind him abruptly snapped to a blinding, stark white background. A massive, undeniably authentic internal ledger appeared, magnified 100 times for every single billionaire in the room to read clearly. The bold red header across the top explicitly read as the suppressed emergency grant allocations. Brian stopped speaking mid-sentence. His charismatic smile instantly melted into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. Before he could even shout an order to the confused technical staff, scrambling in the aisles, the high-definition speakers surrounding the amphitheater crackled to life. A newly compiled sequence of heavily encrypted financial recordings from late-night executive calls echoed off the acoustic glass walls. The entire audience heard Brian actively instructing his chief financial officer to intentionally reroute $7,500,000 of state-funded pediatric medical grants directly into a shadow corporate account to artificially inflate their quarterly profit margins. The sheer arrogance in his recorded voice, casually discussing the financial starvation of local health wards, was broadcast at maximum stadium volume. The reaction inside the amphitheater was instantaneous and spectacularly violent. The collective gasp from 300 elite investors sucked the oxygen out of the massive room. These were utterly ruthless business people who cared deeply about their own survival, and they immediately recognized the fatal scent of a massive federal indictment. Richard, the primary majority shareholder, who had sat in my dining room just days prior, was the very first person to move. He did not ask a single question. He did not wait for an explanation. He aggressively slammed his leather portfolio shut, stood up from his front row VIP seat, and began marching directly toward the exit doors. "Richard, wait! This is a fabricated attack!" Brian screamed into his lapel microphone, his voice cracking with sheer unfiltered panic as he physically leaped off the stage to chase down his most important backer. "You are completely toxic, Brian. Richard fired back loudly, ensuring every single person in the room heard his absolute withdrawal. My legal team will be officially divesting every single cent of our $300 million holding within the next 60 minutes. Do not ever contact my office again. Like a rapid, unstoppable chain reaction, the rest of the room followed suit. Chairs scraped loudly against the expensive hardwood floors. Frantic executives pulled out their cellular phones, aggressively shouting orders to their stockbrokers to dump DataCore shares immediately. The Grand Summit collapsed into absolute chaotic anarchy. Amidst the violently swirling panic, Clara desperately attempted to intervene and save the crumbling empire she had fought so ruthlessly to inherit. She rushed the stage, grabbing a secondary microphone from a stunned panelist. Her designer dress looked utterly ridiculous against the backdrop of severe federal financial crimes. Listen to me. This is the pathetic, jealous work of his mentally unstable ex-wife. These documents are completely falsified, Clara yelled, her voice shrill and echoing poorly through the massive auditorium. Up in the control booth, I simply tapped Elias on the shoulder. He nodded and triggered the final phase of the digital payload. The screen behind Clara shifted rapidly from the financial ledgers to a scrolling, highly magnified display of her own personal, unencrypted text messages. They were direct communications between Clara and the chief medical officer, showing her blatantly demanding priority pharmaceutical access for her private country club friends, explicitly threatening to use Brian's influence to fire anyone who refused to alter the patient queue. Clara turned around to look at the screen. The blood drained entirely from her heavily manicured face as she read her own arrogant, incriminating words, broadcasted in 50-point font. Her desperate defense instantly evaporated, replaced by the crushing realization that she was just as legally implicated as the man she was trying to defend. The crowd began actively jeering at her, capturing her humiliation on hundreds of smartphone cameras. I did not stay to watch them desperately attempt to restore order. My work in the shadows was entirely finished. I calmly exited the control booth, took the private service elevator, and descended all 60 floors to the grand marble-floored main lobby. The timing of the automated federal tip I had submitted exactly 3 hours earlier was completely flawless. Just as the polished elevator doors slid open to the ground floor, the heavy revolving glass doors of the building were violently pushed aside. Over a dozen heavily armed agents from the Federal Economic Crimes Division, accompanied by local uniformed police officers, swarmed into the lobby. They marched with brutal, terrifying purpose, completely ignoring the frantic receptionists and entirely bypassing the security turnstiles. I stood quietly near a large decorative indoor fountain and watched as the elevator bank on the opposite side of the lobby opened. Brian was practically dragged out by his own panicked security team, desperately trying to hustle him toward a subterranean private parking garage. He never made it. 2 federal agents abruptly intercepted him, firmly grabbing his custom-tailored shoulders and slamming him violently against the cold marble wall. "You are being detained under strict suspicion of massive corporate fraud, grand embezzlement, and severe violations of the federal public health mandate," the lead agent barked loudly, forcefully pulling Brian's arms behind his back and securing the heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. Brian struggled wildly, his immaculate suit violently torn, his carefully groomed hair falling chaotically across his sweating face. He looked absolutely pathetic, a completely broken tyrant stripped of his entire kingdom in less than 20 minutes. As the agents hauled him roughly toward the exit, his wildly darting eyes finally locked onto mine across the massive expanse of the lobby. He saw me standing there, perfectly calm, perfectly silent, holding the simple black leather notebook that contained the ashes of his entire life. He opened his mouth to scream at me, to hurl one final desperate curse, but a federal agent shoved him forcefully through the revolving doors before he could utter a single syllable. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply turned my back on the screaming sirens and the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the towering glass facade. I pushed open the side exit doors and stepped out onto the bustling city sidewalk. The crisp morning air hit my face, entirely free from the suffocating toxic atmosphere of the DataCore empire. The dominoes had completely finished falling, leaving behind nothing but a shattered, irredeemable mess, and for the very first time in years, I took a deep, unrestricted breath of genuine, absolute freedom. The final echo of the judge's wooden gavel was the most beautiful symphony I had ever heard. It marked the absolute conclusion of a highly publicized, brutal legal process that spanned exactly 18 months. Brian was permanently stripped of his chief executive title by a unanimous, heavily expedited board vote. Every single one of his domestic and offshore financial accounts was immediately frozen by federal order, completely liquidating his massive personal wealth to establish an expansive compensation fund for the pediatric families he had so callously defrauded. The towering, intimidating empire he had built on the fragile backs of sick children was entirely dismantled piece by piece. For Maya and me, the heavy, suffocating iron cage of financial terror was finally destroyed. The massive whistleblower settlement I received securely guaranteed that Maya's incredibly complex medical treatments were fully funded for the rest of her life. We were completely liberated from his manipulative economic control. Clara did not escape the catastrophic blast radius of her own extreme arrogance. She quickly discovered that federal prosecutors do not care about designer dresses or country club memberships. She was formally indicted on 4 separate counts of criminal fraud and direct collusion. Facing a mandatory minimum sentence of 7 to 10 years in a federal penitentiary, her formerly pristine, socially curated life was reduced to a bleak, terrifying reality of legal defense fees and strict bail conditions. During Brian's final sentencing hearing, he was granted a brief moment to address the courtroom. He turned his tired, hollowed eyes toward the back row where I sat quietly. He looked remarkably small wearing a standard orange county jumpsuit instead of his custom-tailored silk suits. He offered a tearful, desperate apology, begging for a tiny fraction of my forgiveness. I simply stood up, smoothing the front of my skirt, and looked down at him with absolute, unwavering calm. "I do not accept your apology, Brian," I stated clearly, ensuring the court stenographer captured every single syllable. "You demanded my complete silence, assuming it meant I was broken. But my silence was never a surrender. It was the heavy price I willingly paid to reclaim true justice for my child and for every other child you threw away. You are exactly where you belong." The true victory, however, was not his incarceration. The true victory was watching my brilliant daughter slowly unlearn her severe trauma. Maya no longer sits rigidly on the floor, artificially controlling her breathing to hide her natural emotions. Last Tuesday afternoon, she dropped a heavy glass of juice on the kitchen floor. Instead of freezing in sheer panic or retreating into absolute silence, she simply cried because she was startled. I knelt down, swept her into my arms, and held her tightly until she laughed. She is finally allowed to be a fragile, loud, and entirely normal 7-year-old girl who never has to desperately perform for a father's conditional love ever again. I did not return to the dark, freezing basement archives. Armed with the expansive legal settlement and an ironclad resolve, Elias and I officially launched an independent, highly aggressive medical oversight organization. Our sole unyielding mission is to actively audit major healthcare databases, ensuring that absolutely no parent ever has to stand in a cold hospital corridor and choose between their child's life and a corporate executive's quarterly bonus. As Maya and I walked out of the heavy brass doors of the federal courthouse for the very last time, the bright afternoon sun instantly warmed our faces. Maya grabbed my hand tightly, pointing excitedly at a vibrant yellow butterfly fluttering near the marble steps. I smiled, squeezing her small fingers in return. We kept walking forward straight into the brilliant, boundless light, and I never once looked back at the ruined man we left behind in the dark. Thank you so sincerely to our wonderful audience for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please share your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's journey compelling and want to support our team, please consider helping us with just $1. Your kindness provides the essential budget to pay our hardworking staff, helping them feed their families and continue creating these powerful stories for you. You can easily donate by scanning the PayPal QR code currently on your screen or by clicking the PayPal link in the video description or the comment section. Thank you for your incredible support.